All right, well, we're back. We're still back in Revelation. We're going to pick it up where we left off last week, Revelation chapter 2. And we finished up with verse 1, which gave us the greeting, gave us a bit of a historical perspective of what Ephesus was and why they were so important. But we have to remember also that Ephesus, this period that he's talking to, this church age, this was the church age that was within the first 100 years of Christ. So many of these people saw Christ. They walked with Jesus. They saw his miracles. Many of these people in this first century church, especially here, this group, they had witnessed all of the things that Jesus had done. And they knew the disciples. And they expected, because they saw the crucifixion, they saw his resurrection, they saw him ascend back up into heaven, they heard everything that he said, and so they were expecting, as we are today in our age, we're expecting Christ to return, and to rapture the church and to take the church home to heaven any day now. Well, they were in the same situation. They really expected it many of them in their lifetime. So some of these folks would have been young folk or middle-aged folk when Jesus was around. Now they've grown old. Some have started to die, and things aren't working out the way that they expected. So last week we talked about the seven stars and the seven golden candlesticks. We explained what that was about. Let's look at verse 2 now. And Jesus is speaking to John and through John, and he's recording what Jesus is telling him. Here's what Jesus says in what we know of as verse 2. Again, we're talking about the church at Ephesus. Jesus says, I know thy works, and thy labor, and thy patience, and how thou canst not bear them which are evil. And thou hast tried them which say they are apostles and are not, and hast found them liars. Jesus is talking, and I think we may have covered this last week, talking about their works. No one gets to heaven by their works. But Jesus says, I've seen your work. I know what you can do. I know what you're capable of. And I know your labor. Now, the word labor here means to, back when I was a older teenage, we had posters, keep on trucking, keep on keeping on. That's kind of what this is, to labor. He says, I know your labors, and I know that you keep on keeping on. Even when you're tired and you're weary and you feel beat down, I know that you keep on keeping on. And these are all attributes and things that Jesus is commending them over, is the fact that I know your works, I know what you're capable of, I know that your labors, that even maybe when he's talking to this church, when you want to quit, you don't. You still go on with it, you still persevere. I know your labors, I know your works. He says, and I know your patience. Patience is persevering. That is more than just, not losing your cool when you're standing behind somebody at the checkout line at the Kroger store. It's not that kind of patience. It's the kind of patience that no matter what happens, you're still going to push through whatever the problems are. You're going to get through it. You're going to push through it. You're going to be patient. You're going to persevere. It means it's a matter of having endurance in under extreme pressure. And those were some of the things that this church had in their favor, and Jesus was commending them about that. And then he says, and I know, and this is something that the modern church needs to go back and look at. Jesus points out the fact that I know as a church you can't stand evil. You can't stand those people that come in and they teach a lie, they preach a lie, they preach some false doctrine. He says, and I know that you can't stand them, and you've proven them to be liars. the church today, the modern church, where sin has, let's say, expanded and gotten a lot worse than it was when I was younger. Things today are accepted and even promoted and pushed by society, which weren't back in those days when we were all younger. So you're going to hear a little noise, I think, from my neighbor with his lawnmower. I apologize for that. But what happened, rather than the church taking a stand and holding our ground, so many churches have moved into that vacuum where evil has expanded and left the vacuum. Many of the churches has moved into that and accepted some of the evil that the world has accepted as normal and status quo. The church at Ephesus would not, could not, and did not do that. They stood their ground. Right was right, wrong is wrong, false doctrine is false doctrine, and true doctrine is still the truth. And they didn't mince words or cut corners with anybody. And verse 3, now let's move up to verse 3. And hast borne and hast patience, and for my name's sake hast labored and hast not fainted. So Jesus starts off with the commendations, the good points about this church. He said, I know what you've been through, I know what you're going through, and I know where you still stand. Then we get to verse 4. And I remember back in the day when I was a young man working, and you'd go in for your yearly interview or review to either get a raise in pay or stay where you were. And they would call you in, and when you're a young guy, or a young woman, you go in there and they hit you first with tell you all the good things about you, and you think, well, I probably got this one sewn up, and then they hit you with the magic word "but," and that "but" erases all the attaboys. There's another saying about there, but that word "but" erases all of the good things that you've heard. And that's what Jesus does here. He says, and it's the word nevertheless, verse 4. Let me read it. Nevertheless. That had to take the wind out of their sails, because it just does. Nevertheless, I have somewhat against thee. He's talking to this church age. He said, I have somewhat against thee, because thou hast left thy first love. Now, that doesn't mean that they love Jesus any less. They just don't love him with perhaps the strength that they at one time did. And let's remember this, back when you met that the girl, if you're a guy, you met the girl, and she was thus the girl that you knew you were going to be with. Or maybe if you're a girl or a woman, you met the guy that, well, hopefully you married. And at one time, that was just, they were the stars in our universe. We couldn't think of them enough. We couldn't talk about them enough. We wanted to tell everybody, I've got the best girl in the world. We wanted to tell people because, we had that strong love, that enthusiasm to tell others about this treasure in a person that we have found. But now 30 or 40 years into a marriage, the love's there. But the passion, the excitement, the desire, to rush home, to be with that person, to talk to that your spouse, your mate, with every word, you just hang on after 30 or 40 or 20 years, you just you expect them to be there. You can pretty well anticipate how the evening's going to go. You know what each other like and what they don't like, and you know the words that will start an argument and the way to avoid an argument, and you know when to just shut up. If you're a guy, you just shut up and you just do. Come on, the guys know what I'm talking about. Probably women do too. But that's kind of what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is saying, nevertheless, I have somewhat against it because you've lost your first love. See, perhaps they weren't as excited about being born again. They weren't as excited about Jesus as they were when they first came to know him. When you know, some of these folks, when they walked with Jesus and they knew Jesus, and they were so excited about everything that he was doing, his message, his miracles, just being around him, his persona, his everything about him, and they couldn't get enough. They just hung on his every word. They couldn't do enough for him. They couldn't tell enough people about him. It's kind of like that man or woman that you're still married to after 30, 40, 50 years. Okay, you know, they're there. They'll be there. You couldn't imagine living without them, but not that important. There are other things that are far more important. And I'm not trying to be mean-spirited because, you know, my wife's going to watch this too. It's just a matter of fact. I mean, you just kind of lose that we all had when we first fell in love. Same thing's true when we first fell in love with Jesus. It's been a long time since I was born again, and I vaguely remember the excitement that I had. I felt born again. I felt renewed. I felt cleansed. I felt, you know, like I was walking on cloud nine. And I wanted to tell everybody about Jesus. It's been 30 or 40 years, 50 years now. I still want to tell people about Jesus, but if you're like me, you kind of lost your first love. He's always important. He's always out there, and we're always thinking, at least I am always thinking, but I'm not always doing the very best I can to be a witness, a representative, an ambassador, an evangelist for Christ, because other life got in the way. That's the same thing that happened to this Ephesian church. Life got in the way. Jesus didn't come back. They've seen some of their people die. Paul addressed this too, but they've seen some of their people die. Jesus is still not here. Things are going on as they have been. Here we are 2,000 years later. Things are going on as they have been. They're getting more vile and evil, more violent. Maybe that's because we've lost our first love. Jesus said, you've done a lot of things right. And to you, Christian, you've done a lot of things right. And I look at you and I have to point back at me, but there's so much more we could be doing. We need to recapture that first love. Because Jesus says you've done all these great things and these wonderful things. Nonetheless, or nevertheless, or it could say, but, that's a few things I have against you. And the first thing he talks about is you've lost your first love. In other words, if Jesus were speaking, he would say, I'm not near as important to you as I should be, as I could be, and as I have been. Shame on us. But we're all the same. You know, it's hard to be enthusiastic about something every day, even though we have more than anybody in the world something to be enthused about every day. But salvation is real. We know we're born again. We know nothing can shake that. We can't lose that. We know that we need to tell others about Christ. We know we need to show our love for Christ. But like the Ephesian church, kind of lost some of the fire, haven't we? That was Jesus' big concern here. He says, nevertheless, I have someone against thee, because thou hast left thy first love. And their first love was Christ. And our first love should be Christ. It was at one time. I'm going to close with verse 5. We'll come back and visit this again, but I just want to read this. We'll pick it up next week. He says, remember therefore from whence thou art fallen, and repent. And do the first works, or else I will come unto thee quickly, and remove thy candlestick out of this place, except thou repent. We'll pick it up next week with that verse and go into it. Thanks for coming and visiting with me again. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.